Well, good morning, everyone.
Hello.
Thanks so much for having me back. It's always something to look forward to in January and February. You know it's coming, right? So this is always exciting. And today I was asked to talk a little bit about the title is the changing leadership of the US in the world's economy. And I do have a plan. So it's not just undirected brabbling. So we're going to do this in 4 steps. And afterwards, obviously, we have plenty of time for questions, right? Which I'm really looking forward to. So we're going to start out by looking at sort of this big turning point in global trade politics after World War II. That was really a turning point. And the US was a pivotal player in this turn towards a freer, or as we call it in the field, a more liberal global economy. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Then we will briefly, without going into the sometimes boring sort of technical details of that sort of system, describe some of the basic elements, right? So how did the system actually function? What were the components of that system, right? Then we basically look at that turn from liberalism to neoliberalism. So that's towards the end of the 1970s and sort of with the incoming Reagan presidency. There's another significant shift. And then this period lasted rather long until roughly the time of the first Trump presidency, right? So we have 4 phases here. And then at the very end, I'm going to speculate a little bit. The accompanying book that comes with the series, the author of that article, Drexler, sort of speculates on 4 potential scenarios for the future. So I'm going to add my own sort of spin to this, okay? Okay, so let's jump right in. So without going too much into sort of the prehistory of the trade system that came after 1945, I just want to say 2 things about that period. So that's basically this interwar period, right? 1918 to 1945. As you might be aware of, this was economically speaking a very turbulent time, right? I mean, we had obviously the after effects of World War I. We had a depression, right? But when it comes to trade, it's important to keep in mind that the prevailing dogma at the time was inspired by what we call protectionism, right? Or it's also known as mercantilism. So the idea was that countries would basically really sort of try and, for the lack of a better word, screw each other over, right? As good as possible. Excuse my English, but I couldn't come up with any better term on the spot. So maybe the more diplomatic formulation would be there was a lot of trade manipulation going on, right? Countries were trying to derive any benefits, any gains possible from manipulating trade, as well as manipulating their own currencies, right, in order to undercut other countries. Okay, so this was standard operating procedure, right, and most countries followed that, including the United States. Right, the United States was at that point, particularly starting in the 30s, then in the wake of the Great Depression, was very protectionist. They imposed the famous Smoot-Hawley tariffs, right, which really sort of increased the tariffs on imported goods dramatically. I'll show you some data, comparative data, so you see where we were at the time. So fast forward now, it's 1945. Actually, it starts already in 1944. And the US obviously comes out of that sort of interwar isolationism, right? I mean, obviously the US was pivotal in defeating the Nazis and the Japanese. But at that point already, American policymakers were thinking sort of, okay, what are we going to do after that war is over, right? We know that sort of communism is lurking, so to speak, in Eastern Europe. It's probably going to be trying to expand its influence, right? We have learned our lessons from the interwar period, and that was pretty much a losing game for everybody. So what can we do, right, to stabilize international relations, support sort of reconstruction, and just generally, you know, improve international relations? And that's sort of the point where the policymakers decide that they were gonna pursue a more liberal economic policy. That means the overarching goal was to create what we call a rules-based international economy, right? So the emphasis here is really on rules, a framework that would basically apply to all countries that were willing to play by those rules, right? The sort of the intellectual mastermind of this post-World War II system, which subsequently became known as the Bretton Woods system, and that's simply because the crucial conference, right, at which this system was designed, negotiated, and agreed on, happened in Bretton Woods, which is sort of, to the best of my knowledge, a little spa or winter sport resort town in New Hampshire, I think. The mastermind behind it, though, was a very famous British economist, John Maynard Keynes, right, who became sort of, I mean, we all know roughly what we associate him with Keynesianism, right? But he really sort of conceptualized this system and subsequently convinced, you know, a lot of countries that were there at Bretton Woods to sort of buy into the basic arguments, right, for that. So the idea was Keynes was, you know, Keynes was very supportive of capitalism, right? Generally speaking, he said it's the best way that we can generate actually, you know, economic growth. It's the best way to improve living standards around the world. But it is also a way of doing things in the economy that occasionally creates crisis moments, right? I mean, we know that there's boom and bust, right? There's just a inherent instability in capitalism. So the goal here was to basically allow this capitalist system to do its magic, right? Generate economic growth, also internationally, and at the same time allow countries to intervene in the economy during crisis moments, okay? Now, with regard to the international dimension of this, he proposed basically three institutions, right? Three organizations. And they are particularly the first two have for many decades been known as the Bretton Woods organizations, right? So this was the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, which was basically there to assist countries in stabilizing their currencies, right? Making sure that they could exchange these currencies around the globe, and could help countries that had debt or balance of payment problems, right, with loans. So that's the monetary side. And we had the World Bank, which was initially there to help the Europeans reconstruct right after the war, but eventually would become basically a major lender for any less developed country, right, that required loans, development loans. And then the third pillar, and that's the one we're going to focus on specifically here, is the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, right? The short version of this is GATT. That really sort of became the foundation for the international trade system after 1945, and that for many, many decades, actually. So what were the underpinnings briefly of this? So the basis is liberal trade theory, right? Liberal trade theory basically says free trade is good, right? You want to make, sorry, go ahead.
Is GATT the one that is now called
the World Trade Organization?
WTO.
Exactly.
Okay.
Right? So the World Trade Organization is the successor to GATT, right? It's basically, I always explain this, it's like GATT was kind of like it was an agreement, but it was what we call a technical agreement, right? So it didn't come with a whole organization, right, behind it. It was rather sort of a small operation, but very effective actually to a certain point. And then in 1994, we switched to the World Trade Organization, right? And GATT became sort of a part of that. Yeah, I'm gonna leave it at that, right? So, yeah. But we will come back to the World Trade Organization towards the end. So liberal trade theory basically says, if we have sort of trade, then that's a good thing, right? Because trade basically forces countries to specialize, right? Every country has certain things that it's particularly good at making. And so in trying to make everything at home, you often waste a lot of resources, right? Because for whatever reason, other countries might be better at doing certain things, right? So the idea was that countries would specialize, they have comparative advantages, and then they would trade for the rest, right? And so the idea was that this would be advantageous for all the countries that played by the rules, right? So how does this fit into the broader sort of foreign policy? Well, the second argument here was that if we have free trade, then free trade basically forces countries to collaborate with each other, right? They have to solve any emerging problems, right? Out of that growing mutual reliance on each other collectively, right? And so the assumption was that trade, if done well, if organized with the help of rules, would lead to more peaceful relations in the long run, right? So that was the fundamental thinking behind that. Now, the main sort of purpose of the general agreement on tariffs and trades was to reduce tariffs, right? I assume everybody knows what a tariff is. It's nothing but it's basically a tax on imported goods from abroad, right? Now, the major contribution of GATT was to, over the decades, drastically reduce the tariffs. Right? And I show you this here in comparison. So this is obviously the long view, right? But when you look at sort of this spike here in 1930, that smooth Harley, we were almost at 60% tariff, 60%. Right? Right now, sort of around the globe, roughly, as a rule of thumb, we're somewhere around 5%, right? Tariffs for merchandise goods, right? So that's tangible goods, right? So there's a drastic reduction in tariff rates, right? That means it's simply much cheaper now, or much easier, right, to export and import, because tariffs play a relatively small role, right? Okay, now this is the growth of global exports, right, since 1950. That data is based on, I mean, that's WTO data, right? We find this at the web page, right? It's a dramatic growth of trade, right? It's actually an explosion of trade, right, over the last 60 years, like 70 years. We've had certain downturns, right? But if I had to draw a trend line over that, right, it would go one way pretty much, right? And that's up, right? So very elastic, very resilient actually, right? International trade has grown despite certain crisis moments, right? The 1970s, yeah, even during the 1980s, right? When you had high inflation and then again in the 90s. And here you have some sort of downturns. I mean, that's obviously the 2008, like the real estate bubble, right? And then the financial crisis and the brief recession. And then obviously you also have COVID, right? Yeah. But it has always bounced back, right? Trade has bounced back. So obviously a lot of things have happened over those 60 years, structurally, right, with the global economy. We have removed a lot of other barriers, not just tariffs, right? It's gotten very easy to for companies, for example, to invest in other countries, right? Nowadays, a lot of products are truly global products, right? It means they are no longer made in just one place and then exported, sort of how it used to be. But in order to make a lot of products, you have to import and export components, right? And then you often have final assembly in one particular place. Right? How many of you have an iPhone? All right, so, and the others probably, the others will have an Android, some form of Android phone, right?
Android.
So it actually doesn't really matter. I just know one or two studies that have looked at iPhones, have components from 22 countries in them, right? So these are huge, global, very complex supply chains, right? In order to make a final product. And that's why you will never see on an iPhone set that says made in America, right? You see maybe designed or final assembly, right? Because there's just too many other countries involved. And that's true for a lot of products, also cars, right? So let's go back though to the 60s and 70s, so, or 50s and 60s. That system really works well, right? GATT actually does wonders, right, for trade. Trade rebounds, expands. You have, people still talk, I mean, at least, they remember the economic miracle, right, of the 50s and 60s in Europe, right? So this thing works, right? Until it doesn't. Okay? So one unintended side effect of this growing trade and cross-border economic activity is that it puts increasing strain on the dollar gold standard, right? So the dollar gold standard was sort of this other big component. I don't want to go too much into that, but the dollar gold standard was the way that the countries agreed to run, so to speak, their monetary relations after World War II. You can't forget that the US by 1945 controlled 2/3 of the global gold reserves, right? 2/3. And in order to stabilize those monetary relations, right, in order to make it hard for countries or impossible to constantly devalue their own currency, right, in order to further exports, they created, and everybody agreed on that, we're gonna use the dollar gold standard, right? The dollar as the lead currency, at least in the Western world, was tied to gold, right? There were fixed exchange rates. 1 fine ounce of gold was $35, right? And then the dollar was tied to other currencies also in fixed exchange rates. And those exchange rates couldn't be changed unless they were renegotiated, right, in the IMF. So you didn't have that crazy, daily fluctuation of exchange rates. If countries had troubles, they had to go to the IMF and said, please, can we renegotiate that, right? And that came obviously with conditions. So because the global economy grows so much in the 50s and 60s, we have a problem. By 1971, there's too many dollars in the global system, and you can't maintain that exchange rate with gold, right? So the US didn't have enough gold reserves to guarantee the value, so to speak, of all the dollars that were floating out there in the global economy, right? And so Nixon in 1971 has to say, I'm sorry, people, but that's it, right? We're stopping the dollar gold standard, right? Because the US wasn't willing to really change the exchange rate, right? This would have been a huge embarrassment. And instead, they decided to end that system, right? I know this is very technical, right? But you might wonder, okay, why are there more dollars out there? Well, because countries take out loans from banks, from other countries. You charge interest, right? I mean, that's how banks make money, right? They create money out of nothing, right? Well, the same thing happens with dollars, globally speaking, right? You have this growing, so to speak, pile of dollars, so to speak, but you have a finite amount of gold on this side, right? And that wasn't sustainable in the long run. So that, of course, was only part of the turbulence of the 1970s. You all remember the oil crisis, right? The inflation, Actually, we had stagflation then, right? So high unemployment and high inflation. And unfortunately, because most politicians don't ever finish books, just like our students, right? They forgot the second part of what Keynes actually said, right? Keynes always said, yeah, when countries run into crisis moments, they should basically spend money, right, to make up the difference and sort of get the economy back on its feet. But he also said, once the economy is recovered, you have to stop spending, right? Bring your spending down. That's what a lot of politicians forgot, right? It's just too easy to spend our money, right? Left and right. So that didn't work in that situation though, right? You can't fight inflation, unemployment by pumping even more money into the economy, right? So Keynes would have probably rotated in his grave at that point, right? But anyway, so at that point, by the late 1970s, that comes to an end, right? And of course, trade suffered from all of this, right? There was a lot of turbulences in the global trade system. And then we have a new incoming administration, right? We have a whole new set of ideas coming in. Reagan came in. And with Reagan, obviously, this idea of small government or smaller government, right? Remember, I famously said, you know, if somebody from the government knocks on your door and says, I'm from the government, I'm here to help you run. So that ideological stance, and he had a partner, right, on the other side of the Atlantic, who was his sort of important sidekick. Thatcher, right? So those two, obviously not single-handedly, but they represent a fundamental shift in the thinking, right? That governments had to get out of the economy, right? Stop sort of meddling in the economy. And let's do the opposite, right? Let's push this whole liberal system to the extreme, right? And that's when the term neoliberalism is formed, right? So it's more emphasis, even more emphasis on free markets, unrestricted markets, right? That's why I call it liberalism on steroids, right? And that became sort of the defining paradigm in the 80s, 90s, all the way up basically to, I would say maybe about 10 years ago, right? This was sort of the mantra that was also promoted by all these organizations, right? Whenever countries change their narrative and their sort of outlook, then eventually it filters into or through to those organizations, right? So that was a really important precondition for what we call in retrospect hyperglobalization, right? So that's when, if I showed you a ton of other statistics, that's when you see sort of the starting of the outsourcing of manufacturing jobs, right? Because we were removing more and more barriers to do that, right? It became easier and easier for companies to just set up shop anywhere around the world, right? Which of course creates a system that is even more sort of interconnected, right? Tightly interconnected. And a lot of countries obviously also bought into this, right? I mean, we brought a lot of countries into this system, right? I'm just constantly thinking or reminding myself of like the whole Eastern Bloc, right? After 1991, right? They all pretty much like became integrated in that global economy, right? African countries, right? And so on and so on and so on, right? So it was a very powerful narrative, right? Did I hit it twice? Oh, sorry. Right? So, thank you. The term for this new way of thinking, right? That unrestricted markets is sort of the best way to go forward. It became known as the Washington Consensus. Okay. Makes sense because the IMF and the World Bank, if you've ever been in Washington, the World Bank and the IMF is like a stone throw away from the White House, right? So just around the corner from the White House. And so that just symbolizes sort of the influence that the US also has in these organizations at the end of the day, right? So I'll just summarize what I basically just said, right? We further lower tariffs. We also remove non-tariff barriers. So tariffs are these import taxes, right, on foreign goods. But then countries also, of course, can manipulate trade in a lot of other ways that don't involve tariffs, right? Safety standards, for example, right? Sanitary standards, right? Health standards, labor standards, environmental standards, all kinds of bureaucratic procedures and machinations, right? So there's under US leadership, we also tried to sort of rein in a lot of that, right? Which again makes it, of course, easier to do business in other countries, but comes with all these side effects, right? Of job loss, and so on and so on. Right? So now we can sort of get to the 2016, 2017, at which point, obviously, the narrative starts to change, right? I mean, it didn't start with the Trump presidency, right? There were signs of trouble ahead of that. It's just a lot of people, if you're not into this kind of stuff on a daily basis, you don't really, and why would you, right? But there was trouble on the horizon even before 2017. And a lot of that had to do with not just the outsourcing of jobs, but also, of course, with the rise of China. Right? China enters the World Trade Organization in 2001, becomes a full member. And at that point, a lot of barriers that had existed prior that tried to sort of reduce China's exports fell away, right? And so China could sort of start and flood the world with its products. Initially, of course, the goal of China was to become the workbench of the world, right? Manufacturing, right? Everything. But about 10, 15 years ago, as that was happening, China was sort of, the Communist Party said, okay, I don't just want to make stuff for other people, right? On order, right? To their order. I myself want to become an innovator, right? And I want to become a big player in the central technologies of the future, right? So there was a lot of that already going on. Obviously, we knew before 2017 that China wasn't playing by the World Trade Organization rules, right? They stole trade secrets, intellectual property. They sort of protected their domestic market, right? So a lot of companies went there to China, right? Because it's 1.2 billion customers, are going to be there. That's where it's happening. That's where the action is. But the Chinese said, yeah, you can come, but I don't want you to import your products. I want you to make your products in China, right? And I want you to do that while collaborating with local companies, right? So there was this massive transfer of knowledge and technology, right? The Chinese were learning, right? As all these foreign companies, and not just American companies. I mean, look at the German car manufacturers, right? They all built their plants in China. Volkswagen, Mercedes, particularly, and the Chinese just gobbled up all that knowledge, right, and strengthened their own industrial base. Listen, so now that's not particularly just China, right? We find a lot of countries that have played catch up, right, over the centuries. I mean, the US at some point did the same thing with Great Britain, right? So we adopted a lot of knowledge from Great Britain, right? So this is something that's a recurring behavior for countries who try to sort of move up the ladder, right? But of course, we increasingly became concerned with that, not just for economic reasons, but increasingly also the geostrategic implications, right? Because we're just in the competition with China at this point, military competition as well as economic competition. And I'll actually be back in 2 weeks where we look more at the technological side of this, right? Sort of the cutting edge information communication technologies, AI, that kind of stuff, right? So now you add to that, and that became known as the China shock, right? We were just shocked by China over the last 2 decades, right? Of how much they were able to catch up. And then you add to that the COVID shock, right? Which kind of made a lot of countries realize how dependent they had become on these global supply chains, right? And for a lot of different things. And so, and I think I have just to show you that. I mean, there were just news last week, or the last 10 days, China announced the largest trade surplus ever, like export record, $1 trillion of exports in 2024. And that's actually already old data. So that's for 2022, where China had sort of represents 31% of the global manufacturing capacity. I just saw a more recent data, also like 2 weeks ago. They are up to over 40% of manufacturing capability is concentrated in China. We've only had 2 other cases in the last 300 years where one country has had that sort of manufacturing power, and that was Great Britain, right, in the 19th century, and then the United States right after World War II. Right? So this is a massive shift in manufacturing power, right, that China has been able to achieve. So that is, of course, well, concerning, right? Let me go back, right? So obviously, a lot of administrations in the US have tried to sort of avoid sort of confrontation, right? They tried to engage with China sort of constructively over these issues, but when I look at the data, obviously this was not really helping, right? The Chinese were like, yeah, that's a very nice idea, I want to do something else, right? So President Trump obviously had, in this case, the right gut instinct, right? It was like, okay, this becomes a really big problem because China is not slowing down, right? They're not changing their behavior. We sort of have to deal with the consequences of that. So he makes a very dramatic shift action, and that's really sort of a pivotal point, right? In 2017, to go back a little bit to protectionism, right? So it imposes tariffs, right? The main reasons for that was the trade deficit, which we have had for, well, since the 1960s, basically, right? We've had a trade deficit, and it's just been growing over the last decades. That means we import way more than we export, right? There's a loss of manufacturing base, right? Simply because we outsourced so much to other parts of the world. And of course, all the foul play, so to speak, by China. Right? China's not the only one, but it's the main culprit, so to speak. Right? So that was a massive shift. Like once a superpower starts changing its mind, right, and the narrative starts changing in Washington, right, then that always sort of has ripple effects, right, throughout the system, right? Because everybody obviously looks to Washington like, oh, they're changing their mind, they're moving away from the previous mantra, right, which was free trade, and we have a rules-based global system, and everybody can profit, and we buttress that up, with our commitments. And now suddenly it's like, no, right, we're going to change our minds here, and we're going to do things differently. That didn't change under the Biden administration. The Biden administration came in and said, well, thanks for your work, that's so it's not so much a partisan issue at this point, right? It's also the Democrats have turned. Well, it's actually fascinating because the Republicans used to be historically the free trade party, right? And they have changed completely, obviously, but also the Democrats have switched, right? They've sort of soured on this whole idea of unrestrained free trade. So Biden keeps all of this, right? He keeps the tariffs on steel and aluminum, but he adds another component to this thing, and that's what we call industrial policy, right? So it's not just blocking certain things from coming in, or if they come in, you make them more expensive, hoping that they will be replaced with domestic products. You also try to actively shape and reshape and strengthen the industrial base of the United States, right? So we had 3 big acts in his presidency, right? The first one was, there were always very lengthy names. The Infrastructure and Employment Act of 2021. Then we had the famous CHIPS Act, right, that dealt specifically with computer chips and sort of the most advanced technology. And then what was the last one? It was called the Inflation Reduction Act. All three of those, a lot of paper to go through. All three of those basically try to encourage companies to basically come home and start investing in manufacturing capacity here. And particularly in those areas that are considered vital for the future, right? Sustainable energy production, right? Batteries, electric vehicles for computer chips, that kind of stuff, right? Both presidents have shown a growing sort of willingness to ignore the World Trade Organization, right? Especially when the World Trade Organization rules against the US. I mean, we are the angels, right? I mean, we also bend the rules, right? So we have increasingly sort of sabotaged the World Trade Organization. And the way we do this is by not allowing, so let's say two countries have a trade dispute with each other. Then they submit that trade dispute to the World Trade Organization. And the World Trade Organization has a panel of independent experts, right, that look at the two sides and then reach a conclusion. The US, since Trump, has basically blocked the selection of new experts to that panel. So the panel doesn't even convene, right? We have sort of undermined that process. Well, if there's nobody there to point out, your sort of, your own manipulations or machinations, then this, of course, weakens the World Trade Organization. But again, both presidents have been willing to sort of sideline the World Trade Organization. Because of COVID, but also because of other things that are happening, right? Conflicts, right? I mean, obviously the Russia-Ukraine war, the tensions in the China Sea have led to a lot of reshuffling in terms of alliances, right? A lot of things are in flux these days. A lot of realignment is happening in the system. And that also applies to global trade, right? Countries are sort of, so we have basically moved from, I don't want to say that the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s were always sort of harmonious, right, and stable. But I think comparatively, when I think a little bit, try to project into the future, it will be considered in hindsight as a relatively calm period, right? I think that's about to change, right? Now, there's a lot of research out there because after COVID, everybody was like, "Oh my God, we got to change our supply chains, right? We're way too dependent on foreign supply chains, global supply chains." There's a lot of research has been going on in the last couple of years that has actually sort of debunked that assumption. It wasn't that the supply chains themselves that were at fault during COVID or shortly after COVID. It was basically the companies that run those supply chains that miscalculated, right? First, they reduced production too much, right? And after that, they had trouble catching up again with this surge in demand. Right? So that the supply chains themselves were not the culprit, right? But nevertheless, there's a lot of like reshuffling going on, right? I mean, there's a lot of companies that are contemplating coming back to the US, right? At least setting up some manufacturing capacity here. But that you're basically hedging your risk, right? Instead of just focusing on one area, let's say Taiwan for chip manufacturing. I mean, if China decides in the future to reconquer or retake Taiwan, then Taiwan is the largest chip manufacturer in the world, like single-handedly, right? So there's a lot of like diversification going on, right? The spreading of risk, right? Just to show you that, right? On the left side, you see sort of distribution of semiconductor manufacturing capacity. Now that's for relatively large semiconductors, 300 Yeah, 300, it's not 300, it's nanometers actually, right? So we measure basically the size of computer chips, right? So 300 is very large. The smallest computer chips, the most advanced nowadays, are 2 nanometers, 2, right? So that's kind of like not the most sophisticated stuff, right? But even there, even as a sort of a proxy, right? An approximation of manufacturing capacity, you see sort of how this is distributed around the globe, right? When it comes to the top, the most advanced chips, China has a smaller share, right? But it's partly because we try to prevent them from developing that capability, right? I mean, Biden struck deals with Japan, South Korea, and brought even the Dutch into the mix, because most people don't know that the most sophisticated manufacturing machines for semiconductors are actually produced in the Netherlands. The leading company in the world is a Dutch company. So they were arm twisted, shall we say, into joining that embargo, the de facto embargo, right, on the most advanced. However, just read 2 days ago, there was an article in the New York Times that even that sort of very ambitious project to curb Chinese capabilities in that area are undermined by the development of black markets. So the most advanced computer chips now are sold and bought on emerging black markets around the world. And the second thing is that the Chinese, facing that shortage, right, had to get inventive, right? And the article said that researchers in China just came up with a new large language model, which is sort of the latest hype in AI technology. And while most, like our Google and Facebook and all these companies need roughly 16,000 microchips per server, right, to process those language models. The Chinese came up with a new software that only uses 2,000 chips, right? And it achieves the same outcome, which means the models are about just as good as the most advanced in the US, right? So you create shortage, right? And then people get creative, right? And they try to make up for that in some other way. So there's definitely an arms race going on. But I don't want to get into that too much, because we'll be hearing about this in 2 weeks, right? The other thing is manufacturing capacity for batteries, right? China is now the largest battery manufacturer in the world by far, right? And of course, they have no problem doing all of this with industrial policy, right? Subsidies for the companies, right? The companies are protected from foreign competition, and they just build up this manufacturing capacity, which brings down the price, right? And then they sort of unleash, so to speak, they unleash the products, right, to the global market. You see this now with electric vehicles. They can offer electric vehicles now for really a much mass market, right? I mean, Bid is the largest company in China. They sell electric vehicles now for about $15,000. I think the cheapest Tesla at this point still runs you at least 25K or something like that, right? So yes, please.
I heard that there's a 100% tariff on Chinese
Yes.
electric cars.
Yes.
That Europe has them for, did you say 15,000?
Well,
About that.
that's what the car would cost, right? That's what it meant.
It costs twice as much.
Yes.
And then I say, so we lose.
Well, we lose global markets, right? I mean,
Well, I'm talking about the people.
oh, you mean
Right,
like,
and a lot of times the economists are just worried about the numbers at the top. I'm more concerned about how the people are living. And you know, it's like, and there's so many things all mixed together.
right.
It's like the global warming, the climate change thing, the electric cars will help, and the exhaustion and the whole bit. It's better, right? If we were to, so why wouldn't we be able to use the less expensive electric cars and get a system that works? I mean, is it just because we like to hate other people around the world so much?
Well, that we can kiss our own car manufacturers goodbye, I would say. I mean, sure, there's the rational, you could say, well, why am I sort of trying to, that you just made a textbook or liberal trade theory argument, like why are we sort of fighting this rather than wasting resources?
See, I'm old, right? I
No,
was
no.
born in 1940, and when I was a kid, I was told, and a lot of other people said, it, we all were told to clean up your plate because there's starving children in China.
Yes,
And now that China has managed through some system in just a few decades to bring tremendous numbers of starving people in China to better, isn't that what we would want? Oh, no, we hate it. Their per capita is still way lower
yes,
than
that's
ours,
true,
isn't it?
yes,
I mean,
absolutely.
why wouldn't we expect where the most people are, or don't we really care about the Declaration of Independence, the ideas at all?
Well, yes, to all of this, right? But that's not how trade works, right? Because we will say, well,
Maybe
but
we need to change how trade
Well,
works.
you know, the question always is if you are in a geostrategic, I mean, sure, I would love an electric vehicle for $15,000, right? I mean, I've never paid more than $12,000 for a car, right? And when I see that the US is just hooked on, you know, SUVs and minivans that cost $45,000, I think that's the median cost for a gas guzzler now. Is that sustainable? Whereas the rest of the world is moving to smaller cars and making them, you know, to try to make them as efficient as possible. So yeah, we're definitely an outlier at this point.
And the United States, if I remember right, only went to the smaller cars when it was hard to get gasoline.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, have you recently drove past, I mean, I don't want to sort of drop names here, right? But have you recently driven past a Ford dealership?
They're all big, huge.
I mean, it's like I'm driving a 2014 Ford Focus, which is a great car, small, is 11 years old and is more gas efficient than any car they have in the fleet right now, right? So
Yeah, well, I can remember, I think it was maybe early 1970s, maybe,
Yeah.
you're maybe different, that Mazdas were getting 45 miles per
yes,
gallon.
yes.
And then, people weren't buying them, I guess.
There's a great documentary about who killed the electric car, right?
Oh,
I don't know if you've seen that.
Oh, yeah.
Like the idea of electric car, I mean, first of all, electric cars have been around for like 120 years, right?
Oh, yeah,
And
they predated gasoline cars.
But, you know, for many, many reasons, you know, thanks, Mr. Ford. You know, we have sort of gotten hooked on this, on the gas engine, right?
There's big money in gas.
So, you know, yes, it would be good, right? If it would do wonders for that kind of stuff. But if you are the president of the United States, you probably have to think about geostrategic implications, right? I mean, you would also expose yourself to China, right? If I just say, okay,
Has China actually been threatening to us?
Oh.
I mean, it's like we've got our warships in their area, they don't have their warships in our area.
well,
We
yeah,
wouldn't put up with it.
yeah,
But we complain when they put up with it. I have a lot of questions.
that's good, right? I guess I look at this right now from a purely American perspective, right? And if you're,
I'm American.
yeah, but if you're on top of the food chain, sort of the theory in international relations would predict whoever is on top of the food chain doesn't want anybody else to sort of, you know,
So do we
challenge
just
them.
teach the Declaration of Independence to our kids in elementary school, like we teach Santa Claus to the preschoolers? It's just a myth?
Well, I honestly have to, I'm not arguing about, I don't know, actually, I have to confess, how, or I can't, you have to explain to me how the Declaration of Independence is connected to the trade issue and the Chinese sort of
Well,
challenge.
I'm just thinking in general, that the people should have their own.
Oh, in terms of freedom, Okay.
And of course, like I said, I remember, I was a kid, of course, but in the 1950s with anti-communism square. I mean, it's like we had communistic societies in America and it was American.
Mhm.
I grew up in Iowa. I lived in Iowa for the last 30 years before last year when I moved here. But it's like the amount of colonies and was a communistic society. There were about 7 of them, the Shakers. Nobody had a problem unless they're big enough that the people that are making too much money are afraid that if it works there, that the poor people here might want it too. It's like, and I think, I understand that China has a blend that isn't like any other, but it seems to be working
Yeah,
for the people. I'm talking.
on the
about
material
because there are
basis.
a lot of people in the United States that are
For
suffering.
some people, doesn't work for all Chinese,
Right.
there's a lot of.
Right, so
human rights
as,
violations.
and that's also a sort of a general development or a general observation applies to many countries as they develop. Right, you could argue, yeah, living standards are sort of, so now they are not dying of hunger, right, and they have a roof over their head. But the inequalities also tend to grow,
Yeah.
right? Which-
Well, in the United States, it's the point, that's the reason Trump won again.
Yes.
It's the
yes,
reason Trump won the first time.
Yes.
It doesn't matter what you say, if the pocketbook issues,
Mhm.
and we don't have much middle class anymore in the United States, it's a problem.
Yep.
And neither of the major parties cares, I mean, one of them talks about it more.
Mhm. Yeah,
But I don't wanna interrupt.
No,
your
I really-
presentation
it's a-
Because there's a time
it's a
limit.
good like intervention here, right? But the main sort of issue is, and all of this happens, so to speak, in a system that, I mean, I don't know, maybe people are ready for one party rule, I don't know, right?
Well,
Right, I mean,
But I think something, well,
if we start,
the last election, one party didn't even have a real primary. They selected
Right, right,
the
right.
person at
Right.
the top.
Right.
And that person was selected 4 years before for vice president.
Mhm.
The people aren't in charge.
right,
And yet Kamala Harris campaigned that they'll protect democracy.
Mhm.
How is that democracy?
no,
Is it like, no, I mean,
agree.
that-
I agree, yeah.
Yes.
Yes, so I get where you're coming from, right? But again, if you are sort of in the big game geostrategically, you can't just succumb, so to speak, to your competitor, right? That's it would make a liberal economist would say that's exactly what has to happen, right? We have to stop trying. The train has left the station basically, right? When it comes to, let's say, electric vehicles,
empires
And-
always end.
and do something else, right? But that's where whatever ideology, geostrategic competition, the people's desire to remain independent and in control of things, right, comes in. There are a lot of motivations that come in where people say, no, I do not want to do this, right? I want to have my own American-made electric vehicle, right? And ideally, I would want one that is so competitive that I can export it to other parts of the world, right? So, you know, the Europeans are doing something similar right now. They desperately try to catch up on the AI technology, right? We're great in regulating AI that hasn't even been invented, but we're really not that good in sort of actually developing it, right? And scale it up. So, see, so we were done with that. I wanted to show you one more thing. So I said there's all this reshuffling going on, right? So between countries, continents, right, new alliances. And a lot of that is obviously motivated by this resurgence, right, or re-emergence of shall we say, soft neo-mercantilism. But there's something else going on that has actually been going on for a while, and that's a fragmentation of the global trade system, right? So as we brought in more and more countries, right, into the World Trade Organization, and the World Trade Organization is consensus-based. That means if you want to have anything done, you have to bring all 189 countries on board, right? So as that has gotten harder over the decades, a lot of countries had said, oh man, this is so much work. I'll just do something smaller, like with fewer countries regionally. Right? The term for that is regional trade agreements. Right? The EU is one of those, right? It's a very prominent one. But another one would be, what is it now called? It used to be called NAFTA. Now it's called US, Canada, Mexico trade agreement. Right? We have at this point hundreds of these regional trade agreements, right? So it's really a very chaotic sort of system of trade agreements that regional groups sort of come up with. And there's a lot of concern, and has been for a while, that this ultimately will undermine the global trade system, right? Because we're just having a lot of regional rules now by which countries play. Yeah.
Are these regional trade agreements not usually the result of the lack of the global agreements providing what's necessary for those countries?
Exactly, right? That was the main explanation, right? Because if you globally, you can only get sort of the basic minimum, right? Because there are so many special needs, so to speak, right? Or special interests that it's very hard to get them all on board, right? So if countries get frustrated enough to say, all right, I'll do this with 20 other countries, let's say in South America, right? Or East Asia. That's exactly the reason, right? That it doesn't go far enough. But that's the nature of consensus-based decision making, right? It's the smallest common denominator, right? Where everybody's still happy. So that's a whole other thing that right now is not really talked about in the media that much. Right? So that brings me to 4 scenarios. The first one is called, what Drexler calls it, the hypocritical post-neoliberalism. So that's basically, in a nutshell, a lot of verbal threats, all right? A lot of like, oh, I'm gonna do this and this and this and this and this, right? And maybe followed up by some selective, measures, but nothing will change with regard to the basics, right? The foundation. So the system will remain open, right? To some extent, right? There's a lot of this for that going back and forth, right? I mean, President Trump has already, instead of immediately slamming Mexico and Canada with 24, slamming everybody with, no, he wanted those 2 countries to, he wanted to impose 25% tariffs on both of these countries and then 10% for everyone else. At this point, we have a threat by February 1 of 10% tariffs on Canada and Mexico, right? The Europeans are already sort of spending sleepless nights in Brussels, know who's going to be next, right? So hypocritical means we're going to talk tough, right? We're going to do a little bit, right? But we're fundamentally not touching anything else because there are too many players involved that still profit from the existing system, right? You can see these sort of tensions play out already in the US, right? You have the Silicon Valley tech bro wing, and you have sort of the hardcore MAGA wing on the other side over H-1B visas. Right?
Yeah.
Which is the main way that these tech companies bring in foreign software engineers, for example. Right? And not all of them are, I noticed from anecdotal stories from acquaintances that work in Silicon Valley, not everybody who comes in on an H-1B visa is like top notch, like on the cutting edge of research and development. There are a lot of people that are average, that keep these companies running, right? Standard operating procedure, but they cost a fraction of what an American engineer would cost. So that's basically just a way to keep wages down in the industry. Right? And because your H-1B visa depends on you being employed by that American company, that engineer from India or China is not going to say, hey, if they say you're going to work 80 hours a week and you will also work over Thanksgiving, that person's not going to say no, right? Because if they get fired, they go home, right? So there's a lot of that going on. right? And of course, top-notch talent also gets attracted, but it's not just about that, right? So it's gonna be interesting how this plays, this first scenario. In any of these scenarios would be interesting. Failed post-neoliberalism, that refers to they do all of this, right? Maybe impose some tariffs, bring back some manufacturing. Of course, the other thing that nobody talks about is the other countries are not just gonna sit there, slap you on one side, yes, please, and the other side too, right?
No.
They're gonna retaliate,
Yeah.
right? So there's always sort of, this is a very complicated game you're playing there, right? You might boost your exports, or you might sort of cut imports, but what's gonna happen to your exports, right? What happens at the end of the day? What's the total, once to make the addition, right? So failed post-nationalism says they will all realize that it doesn't really work out, and they sort of go back to what we had initially, right? So the third one is a lot of countries jump on that sort of, should we say, Trumpian approach, right? More mercantilism, more tariffs. What happens is a sort of a slight decoupling of these sort of trade regions, right? And everything becomes less rule-based, a little more transactional. But it doesn't really result in any big conflicts because, well, we're less sort of exposed to it, right? So that might maybe work, right? That's why he calls it viable, right? So less tension because less mutual exposure, right? And then, of course, it could also be that we go the other extreme, right? The full-blown economic nationalism, where we really start sort of, it's the 1930s hardcore all over again, right? Where we really try to become fully independent from each other. Well, all of them are interesting, right? And I agree with the author of that article, no matter what happens, if you just, I just do this, I'm the lucky person, I get paid to teach this and to read the news about this on a daily basis, right? This is like popcorn movie cinema on steroids, right? Every morning now it's like, all right, let's see what's happening, It's not gonna be boring the next years, right?
No.
Not just 4, but even, I would say the next decade is gonna be very interesting. Yeah.
The full-blown economic nationalism certainly wouldn't work for the USA because we need resources that we don't have.
Yes.
Unless we just control other people, which is entirely against the values we pretend to have.
Yeah, but there's just so much cool real estate out there, Greenland.
Well,
Why not?
that was true with the Europeans going across the United States. And I lived in Arizona for a couple of decades, and there were white people there. I worked for the phone company after I was divorced, and I worked with people that said, oh, they should speak English, right? And there are a lot of, and I'm thinking, they were here first. We took it away from Mexico. Did they not ever learn American history?
Yes.
Right, and it's like, I
understand.
yeah, right.
The question I have is, when globalization was rolling out 20, 30, 50 years ago, how naive was the world, the United States, everybody, and that we're gonna sing kumbaya, kumbaya, and we're all gonna get along together, and this is all gonna work out?
I'm not sure if it was ever really kumbaya. Even if you buy into the arguments that sort of all of this exchange and all of these interconnections the argument was never kumbaya. The argument was it will probably result when you're so interdependent, right? Starting a war, for example, becomes really unattractive, right? Because your costs, your transaction costs are so high, right? Yeah. So it wasn't about like the naive, sort of a certain naivete that this would result in like eternal peace, right? but it would introduce a lot of, obstacles, right, towards, just casually saying, yeah, let's go there and just grab it, right, or just with, yeah, sort of along these lines, right, sort of a little more, and it has become much more costly, right, I mean, if you start wars now, I mean, ask the Russians, right, how they are doing economically, right? That in a sort of an interconnected world, right, fighting these wars or conventional wars over something like territory is insanity at this point, right? It really is. It makes economically absolutely no sense. Right? So I think the arguments for, like, if you want to say globalization, right, were not even just so focused on questions of war and peace, right? It was just fundamentally also a question of, well, what is actually economically efficient, right? It brings me back to the efficiency argument, right? That we can waste a lot of resources trying to make something, right? I mean, or as you sort of hinted at, right? Just accept the fact and figure out where we are actually really good, right? I mean, in that regard, sort of trying so desperately to push gas again, oil and gas exploration. I'm not saying that we won't rely on that for a long time, but as sort of a way of creating tons of jobs in the future, I have to question it honestly, right? Because the other thing that nobody considers in that context is, and that's actually also playing out in China and in other countries, China is now the country that introduces the largest number of robots in the manufacturing process, right? So even if we bring some jobs back, it's not going to be the hundred thousands of jobs that people might think will come back, will be created here. There will be much smaller numbers.
Well, isn't it true that even in this country, we lost more jobs to robotics than to exporting jobs from,
Like,
yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, roughly, I don't have the exact
Exactly,
numbers,
right.
but this is sort of, so all of these like conflicts and tensions are sort of have to be looked at in the context of much larger developments, right?
When it comes to tariffs, though,
Mhm.
if we impose tariffs, those countries turn around and do the same to us. That's what happened in 17 and 18. I know Canada sold crops more than ever before because Chinese went to buy there instead of here, and American farmers lost everything. So,
And China, for example, when the tariffs were imposed on steel and aluminum and a bunch of other things,
sure,
again, China can retaliate and just buy soybeans from Brazil instead of the US, right? And then we end up having to subsidize, to the farmers.
yeah.
Well, I guess we are always the ones that pay the price, no matter what, right?
Robots cost manufacturing jobs, but don't they also lead to robotic engineering
Mhm.
jobs?
Yeah.
People have to
Yeah,
people have to learn how to run the robot. They don't come with,
Mhm.
they don't come with personnel.
Right. There's a huge debate going on in like labor economics, right? What happens? I mean, if we take the past experiences, we had the same concerns with computers and the internet, right? There were always these concerns that this will cost jobs. But the track record actually indicates that there's just some jobs will disappear, right? Also with AI. But we don't fully understand even at this point, or can imagine the kinds of jobs that will come out of this next technological step. I always try to avoid the term technological revolution because those are rarely really revolutions, right? Those are things that build up over a long time. Yes, please, sir.
I was interested in the phase of the fact we started this discussion at the end of World War II. But you left out a very important economic factor at the end of World War II. And that is Marshall Plan thinking.
Yes, yes.
And the US And you can talk about good thing to do or not. The vision was, and it was pretty well agreed at the time, it was a good thing to do. That the US could give money away to rebuild all these war devastated countries. Well, the problem with that is the US has never left the concept of Marshall Plan thinking. It has been embedded in US economic thought ever since the end of World War II. And just to give some examples of that, the US still underwrites the incomplete administrative operation of the United Nations. The US for a long time was just about paying all of the cost of NATO. And the only example I've seen of somebody trying to get away from Marshall Plan thinking for economic policy for the US was when Trump told NATO that they had to pay their fair share for the operation of NATO. So, and that's the only example I can think of. Why is it the US cannot get past Marshall Plan thinking for economic policy?
So first of all, the US does not fully fund NATO.
That's right.
I mean,
Not anymore.
well, it never has, right? I mean, the countries from the get-go
Well,
were,
other countries though haven't paid what's considered their fair share. So who picks up the cost?
well,
The US does.
no. I have to push back a little bit. What the countries haven't done. The countries, a lot of European, I mean, these are European countries, right? The initial thinking of NATO was that when it was established in 1949, was that a lot of countries simply didn't have the capacity to defend themselves initially, right? So what the United States has done during the Cold War, obviously, you stationed a lot of soldiers across Europe, right? But after the end of the Cold War, that has been reduced to a fraction of what it used to be, right? So secondly, NATO troops are national troops, right? I mean, they are theoretical contributions by the European countries to, these battle groups that are, but it's every country for themselves in terms of supplying and providing these troops. So there are financing keys for that, where it's defined what every country contributes to NATO. What the US has always provided, and that past the end of the Cold War, is the nuclear umbrella, right? So that's a hypothetical thing, right? Because unless I have to use them, right, it's I mean, that's the whole point of deterrence, right? And if you make a defense commitment to your allies in Europe, in this case, I mean, against any hypothetical enemy, but I mean, the one we were actually thinking about is Russia, right? What the European countries have not done, and that's the one point I agreed with, that's where Trump was right, was that they had to spend more on their national defense, right? So, but that was a consequence of having the nuclear umbrella for so long, right? That they knew when things got really tough and there was a potential threat from the East, that the US would activate that threat, right? But that's a hypothetical threat, right? And that's the whole way that's how deterrence works, right? So it's not like the US underwrites all of NATO, right? The US pays its contribution, had soldiers stationed, I mean, and also derives a lot of benefits from that, actually. I mean, during the Iraq War, I mean, you still have military bases in, among other places, Germany or Italy. Ramstein, right? I mean, it's a major logistics hub for the US Army, right? It's pivotal for the wars in Iraq and Iran. So, Afghanistan and Iraq, excuse me, right? Let's hope it's not gonna. So he was, I mean, and that realization has been made in Europe, right? I mean, but you have to understand that for basically 60 years, the Germans, if we let's pick the Germans, right? The Germans fundamentally re-socialized themselves right after 1945, right? They said, okay, this famous 0 hour in 1945, at Stunde Null, we have lost everything, right? Because we because we blindly followed Hitler, right, into a war. And then they basically completely changed their outlook and self-understanding. And a fundamental part of that self-understanding, new self-understanding, was a rejection of militarism, period, right? Yes, they had, of course, the Bundeswehr, right? But as an identity element, or an element of national identity, the Germans abhorred the use of military force, right? Now they sort of have to reconsider that, being confronted with the facts, right, of Russian aggression. But that's a lot of, there's a lot of soul searching going on in Germany about that, right? And yet still they've started investing more, right? I mean, how many members does NATO have? 28, I think, at this point. And the latest that I saw was that 16 of those have met sort of Trump's target, right? I mean, Trump came up with in the first presidency with some random number, right? He said, I want at least like 2% or 3% of GDP for national defense, right? And then you have countries like Poland who at this point spend like 4.5%, right? So this is a slow process, right? Because you got to convince a lot of populations that this is actually the way to go, right? It's a learning process, right? But, sorry, this was a very lengthy excursion into this, right? But I'm really skeptical about the claim that the US sort of single-handedly supports NATO, right?
It's
Never
only-
has.
Well, that's not the main point. The main point is the US cannot get out of the mental process of Marshall Plan thinking economic.
Yeah, but the Marshall Plan was a one-time thing, right?
Yeah, and the conditions of the Marshall Plan no longer exist. But that's still the way the US approaches economic policy.
But do you have other examples? No, sorry. Do you have other examples for, like, when you say Marshall Plan thinking, like?
Well, I think I made the point. The other people probably had questions too.
No, go ahead, go ahead. Do you have other examples of Marshall Plan thinking?
Because there's one more thing about the Marshall Plan. I mean, I agree, this was a great way, actually, and in many ways, a very smart way of achieving multiple things simultaneously, right? You reconstructed the Western Europe particularly, right? You insulated, by doing that, you insulated Western European societies from Marxist or communist infiltration, right? Because as people started doing better economically, the attractiveness of sort of communism really dropped significantly, right?
We invested only in the countries we were afraid of, though, like Germany and Japan. In 1970, I was in Belgium and they didn't have the help from the USA that the other.
I would have to look up the data, but I'm pretty sure that most European countries, and that even went as far as Greece and even Austria, which was not a small, a vitally important country in Europe, received extensive Marshall Plan help, right? But ultimately, so you had these two effects, but most of that Marshall Plan money actually came straight back to the US, because what happened with the Marshall Plan money, European countries basically had to buy manufacturing equipment and all kinds of capital goods, and that came straight from the US, right? So it was a very circular thing. This is.
I'm thinking that at the end of World War II, it was pretty easy for the United States to be, there's free trade. At that point, Europe was devastated, Japan was devastated, China was devastated. And that even ties into the Marshall Plan, because we had all this overcapacity in the war. And we need to be able to sell this products.
Yep.
By giving help rebuild Europe, and that produced a market for us.
It was a win-win, actually. I would call this a win-win.
The other countries recovered.
Yeah.
Then, this free trade didn't seem quite as good to us.
Yeah, so, I mean, that isn't, I mean, the Marshall Plan is a good example of that sort of liberal internationalism, right? That was sort of the hallmark of US foreign policy, besides sort of, anti-communism.
Private health though.
Well-
benefit.
Well, depends on what you define as what you want to achieve, right? Is it solely economic, or are you thinking in terms of alliance building, or having sort of security systems, regional security systems that comprise of allies?
We, at the end of World War II, we realized that at the end of World War I, we punished Germany so bad that they just kind of felt the need to start World War II. Because they were just so degraded. But my question is, the topic of today's discussion is the US changing leadership in the world. And I wonder if you could talk about the United States leaving the World Health Organization. It's not exactly an economic question, but it's
Yeah.
part of the US leadership in the world.
Well,
We just completely left the World Health Organization.
Has to do with China again.
I mean, obviously it's sad, right? Because the US is, I mean, at least in absolute numbers, a huge supporter, right? Financial supporter of the World Health Organization.
Yeah.
Has the World Health Organization, I mean, is any organization ever pitch perfect in what it does? No, because organizations often also are just sort of trapped in great power struggles, right? So I mean, it's kind of like a sort of a little bit of a revenge kind of thing, right? I don't, maybe we could even use the word petty, right? For just payback, right? For not being happy with how the World Health Organization acted during COVID, right? Does it make a lot of sense? No. Right? Not when I think about sort of future potential. I mean, now we've seen it, what can happen if these sort of global health crises emerge. The moment you start weakening these international organizations, as imperfect as they might be, I mean, we have nothing better. That's I guess the argument, right? There is really not a very good plan B, right? Without these types of organizations, right? So.
Is there a parallel though there? Because in reality, hypercritical.
Yeah, no, it's a big.
In reality, if I read it, Trump said we left the World Health Organization. In reality, you have to give him a year's notice. And so he's had plenty of time. He said this, he's appeased his base or whatever he's done. But in reality, at this point, nothing happened, and maybe it never will, or maybe there'll be some in between. You know what I mean?
I think that we're gonna see a lot of this, right? There's sort of
He makes us.
grandstanding, right?
There's meaning.
Right, or it's a bargaining chip, right? The threat becomes a bargaining chip, right? To get some concessions, right? I mean, we'll find out. It's a little hard to keep track of all these executive orders. I have to listen to or read some summaries because the list is just never ending.
Yeah.
Yes, please. Ma'am.
Looking at our forward economy, how is the new Bitcoin going to affect our dollar? What's in back of the Bitcoins? Who can use the Bitcoins? Is it just a club of the billionaires to share the money with each other?
Without any oversight, right? Yes, this is the students ask about this all the time, like the cryptocurrencies, right? It's like a libertarian dream come true, right? You create money out of nothing, without any oversight. but now they have sort of the ear, right? Now they have the administration's ear. I'm a little concerned about this, not just because they have a bad track record, right? A lot of people who have pushed that have come up with companies are now in court, right? Or already in prison. With any currency that is not well regulated, there's all kinds of, mischief, right, is possible. I'm very skeptical of it. I don't know if this can become a sort of a big thing, right? Because at this point, as you said, it's just too exclusive, right? And it's actually incredibly, I mean, again, we talked about this 2 weeks from now, AI, crypto, the energy demand for these things is insane, right? I mean, all these companies now like Google, and so they're talking about reactivating old nuclear power plants, right? The 3 Mile Island power plant is supposed to go online again. And they're also talking about, allegedly, there are now companies out there, a handful of companies that are trying to build sort of ready-made mini nuclear power plants, right? So that you can buy yourself, if you're Google, and just set it up somewhere and it's ready to go to cover that energy demand, right? That all of these things are very energy intensive. And with that, CO2 emissions, right? I mean, it depends on how we create that energy, right? That electricity. We'll see.
Still don't know what to do with it.
That's even more popcorn worthy, the crypto.
Problem and like it's not being
Yes.
addressed really.
Yes. So, I mean, we've also left already, I mean, the US has left again, the Paris climate agreement, right? That also has already been on the chopping block, so.
And well, with the wars that started in the last administration, we, and I was saying, every aspect of war is against the goal for the reversing the climate change stuff or whatever. And it's like, and I'm thinking you would have thought that the United States and every country would do everything they could for diplomacy and have war as a last resort in order to save the people in the world. I mean, the earth's still gonna be here no matter what happens. We can blow up the smithereens with a nuclear war and still the earth will be here. But I think it's kind of nice if the people are here too and like whatever. But then somebody said that the Paris agreements exempted war from the goals. Is that true?
So you mean CO2 emissions that are generated because of
That-
war?
that the United States, under Biden, with the Paris agreement again. But that the war is exempt, and I've not found where to look it up, and I thought maybe.
I'm not that familiar with the Paris climate agreement.
And I don't know the detail, maybe I can find it, I haven't looked real hard.
I cannot speak to that, I'm sorry. I'm not an expert in environmental politics.
But you would think that we would do everything we could, hey, it's like, and we haven't. It's like, before Russia invaded Ukraine, there was no diplomacy.
So with Russia,
We are talking, what our administration was doing was telling them what is, that's not diplomacy. And it was contrary to the agreements, oral agreements in 1990. Not to move NATO 1 inch east of Germany if the USSR agreed to the unification of Germany. And then through the decades, we've done exactly that. It was like open the fair.
last word, okay, yes, on one side, on the other hand, NATO was always constructed and conceptualized as a basically open organization, right?
No, but it was sold to the American people, if I remember right, as force to defend against the USSR.
Well, yeah.
And when the USSR broke up, there wasn't any reason anymore to have NATO. Go back to the UN and have global peace.
Yeah, but if you ask the Polish, the Hungarians, you know, the Czechoslovakia and the Baltic countries, they would have told you differently. They would have said and that's why they
But
tried so hard to get.
Russia joined NATO, wanted to be part of the West, and the United States wouldn't let us.
Well, because NATO was designed explicitly, you know, to keep the Russians in check.
It's like
No.
we like war because we
were-
have a defense
I
industry.
think Putin threw this out casually at some point, and I don't know if it was a joke.
It was a
But
joke.
obviously it was never gonna happen. What we did have was that new NATO-Russia council, right? This was sort of a framework that allowed to do consultations with the Russians, right? But though the Eastern European countries, and I have to tell you, and unfortunately, Austria steadfastly claims that it's still neutral and refuses to join NATO, and I think it's the dumbest thing in the world. Because all these other countries on the gut level understood that the next threat to them was gonna come from Russia. And I think the events in the Ukraine just proved their point, you know? So that's why they all joined, right?
That was